Okay, thank you everybody for being here today for the FIPRN keynote address. Joe Simonetti, I'm the Director of Education for the Firearm Injury Prevention Initiative. It is my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Andrew Morral, who is the Greenwald Family Chair in Gun Policy and a Senior Behavioral Scientist at RAND. He's a nationally recognized expert in violence prevention and policy solutions with a focus on reducing violence in U.S. communities and among members of the U.S. Armed Services. Dr. Morral has founded and co-leads RAND's Gun Policy in America initiative, a 10-year research program designed to establish a shared evidence-based foundation for public and policymaker discussions on fair and effective gun policies, a resource that many of us are very highly familiar with and treasure. He also serves as the director of the National Collaborative on Gun Violence Research, a philanthropy that has awarded more than $24 million in research funding since 2018. He's a founding member of the board for the Research Society for the Prevention of Firearm-Related Harms. I've seen Dr. Morral present several times this year on related topics, and it's been fantastic. It's fantastic to have you here, and I'm very excited to hear your talks. Thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, and thank Emmy for inviting me to this. I really feel honored to have been invited, and thank you all for joining. So I'm Andrew Morral. I work at the RAND Corporation. RAND is a nonprofit research organization, nonpartisan. It's been around for 80 years. We work on a wide range of topics. I've been there about 29 years, and during most of that time, I have not worked on firearm violence-related issues. I've really worked on things related to violence often enough. But in 2015, there was a mass shooting in San Bernardino that really scared people in Los Angeles, which is where we're headquartered. And at that time, staff and our trustees and the media were calling our president saying, "What are you doing about firearm violence? So this is obviously one of the top priority issues in the country. What is RAND doing on this, since that's supposedly what you're working on, top priority issues?" And so he canvassed the vice presidents at RAND about what our work in this area was, and it was nil. We had nothing. At that time, in 2015, there was the Dickey Amendment. There still is today, but at that time, it was interpreted to mean that the federal government couldn't fund firearm violence research, and all of RAND's research is sponsor-driven, meaning there has to be someone paying for the research. So there wasn't anyone paying for this kind of research. So what our president decided to do, even though like 99% of our work is sponsor-driven, our president took the limited amount of discretionary funding he had and put it all in this project that was, he asked, is there anything we could do? And I proposed a plan of what we might be able to do. And out of that came funding from our president's office to start what we ended up calling the, did that change? The Gun Policy in America project. How do you do this one again? Click here. Oh, the center one?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So we ended up calling it the Gun Policy in America project. It ended up being the largest internally funded project RAND's ever done. The focus throughout has been to provide the public and policymakers with an assessment of what the evidence is for different kinds of gun policies, to document where the evidence is thin and new research might be helpful, and to develop tools and resources to improve data and research methods. And so that's what we've been doing. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the first two things. The third, if you go to our website, you can find resources like estimates of household firearm violence, firearm ownership over time at the state level and by population subgroups. You can find estimates of non-fatal firearm injury over time. You'd think this would be something the government would be able to provide information on, but it's not available. We have databases of state gun laws that are widely used to do studies of the effects of gun laws and other kinds of tools and resources. So the way I wanted to structure this talk was to start with this puzzle, what I have thought of as a puzzle, which is how dramatically different states are in terms of their rates of firearm homicide and suicide. And I know you've been looking at these numbers in different ways. The way I've presented it here is I've plotted each state in terms of how much higher or lower the state rate is than the national average. And so what you can see is there are some states that are 200 or 300 times the state average for both firearm suicide rates and firearm homicide rates. And there are some states that have almost 95% lower rates than the national average. And the question is why? And I think, I would say that a lot of our research to date has been circling this question and trying to understand it from different perspectives. I think there's a lot of different ways of thinking about why this might be. But what we're really trying to do ultimately is figure out whether there are policy solutions that can be inferred from this kind of variation that would help states do a better job of reducing their gun violence, not just states, but communities. And one of the obvious policy areas to consider is what the state's doing about their gun laws, their gun regulation. And, there's a lot of hope that if, we just had the right gun laws, we could really reduce gun violence in the country. But figuring out whether the different gun laws have an effect is actually pretty difficult. There's a lot of, there's a lot of things happening in states that might be affecting gun violence, including what their policing practices are, economic conditions, demographic makeup, and how that intersects with structural racism and violence. Firearm ownership rates. I know you've been talking about that. And so to understand what the effect of gun laws are, you have to be able to differentiate those effects from these other wider things that might be happening. The second big problem is we really want to know what the effect of the gun law is, not just that these gun laws are correlated with different levels of violence. We want to know that it's the gun law itself that caused these levels of violence. And to establish that kind of causal effect is difficult when you only have 50 states to work with, because it's very difficult to establish a reasonable counterfactual to think about, what would have happened if the state hadn't passed that law. Well, you got to construct a counterfactual that says, what it might have looked like. And if you only have 50 states to work with and they're not being randomly assigned, then those counterfactuals require a lot of assumptions. There's also the problem that some of these policies, there may be kind of two-way effects. Like if homicide's rising, maybe some of these policies are more likely to be passed by a legislature, and then they in turn might affect homicide rates. And so that kind of two-way causation is also a big challenge for trying to estimate the effects of gun laws. And then the last, there's also the fact that states tend to have groups of laws that move together. It's, a state with very permissive laws isn't likely to pass a very restrictive law, and vice versa. So there could be these sort of network effects where laws contribute to each other, and their effects can't just be isolated individually very easily. And lastly, we know from reviewing the literature that when you only have 50 states, and we've also done a big simulation study that you can look at, looking at how much power the kinds of statistical models that are used to isolate the causal effect of gun laws have, and it's really, really low. Almost all the methods that are used, the difference in difference type methods to estimate causal effects of gun laws, have power under 20% to detect effects. And that's a big problem, because when you get power down that low, then the only statistically significant effects you're going to find are ones that greatly exaggerate the effect size of the gun law. And when you're down around 10%, the probability that your statistically significant effect is going to be in the wrong direction approaches 50%. And these are the so-called type M for magnitude and type S for sign errors that are associated with gun law effects. All right, so this was sort of when we started this work in 2016. We knew that there was not very much literature in this area because of the Dickey Amendment. We knew that the literature that existed was very inconsistent and sometimes found opposite effects, possibly because of sign errors or other kinds of problems. And so it was a contradictory literature. And we knew that modeling choices mattered a lot. And the reason we knew that is because everyone's using the same data. We know when we know when these laws passed. We're looking at the same national vital statistics, mortality data or UCR crime data. And yet we're still coming up with different answers across studies. And so that suggests that these modeling choices are very, very important. How you're constructing the counterfactual to make this causal claim, and there's a bunch of different ways of doing that. What covariates you're selecting, if it's true that policing and economics and all these other things are very important to state differences, then those are potential confounds that need to be adjusted for. And so that's going to be important. And then there's a bunch of little technical choices that have to be made. And the thought we had going into this was, going into our reviews, was that these choices are not all equal. There's some that are using reasonable assumptions and some that aren't. And we might be able to start differentiating those and getting a better sense of what the signal says about gun law effects. So ever since then, we've done 5 updates to our Science of Gun Policy report. This is what fuels our website and all of the essays we have on the effects of gun laws. And we just released last month our final scheduled one. Hopefully it won't be the final, but for now it's the final. In each of these, what we're doing is we've searched for evidence of the effect of 18 different gun laws or classes of gun laws on any of these 8 outcomes. And we are intentionally trying to pick outcomes that are of concern to gun owners and the gun industry. Gun owners like defensive gun use or hunting and recreation, gun industry outcomes, as well as the outcomes that are of concern to almost everyone, in terms of suicide, mortality, mass violence, police shootings. So in each of these reviews, we've cast a very wide net, screened thousands and thousands of papers, having to throw out papers that are on electron gun microscopy. But, we found things that are not relevant, but winnowing down at this point by 2025, there's now 207 papers that meet our inclusion criteria for saying something potentially about the effects of one of these gun laws on one of the outcomes of interest to us. This is such a controversial area that we've done a lot to try to be very transparent about how we're doing these evaluations. And so we have published how we decided to rank all the papers and analyses that we review. And we published the rankings of them. Most people don't know this, but we have a whole spreadsheet attached to our report that has all the rankings and everything. And we rank them according to what we believe are the important characteristics that make a study credible in terms of estimating a causal effect. I'm not going to go through them carefully, but basically it has to do with is the causal identification strategy reasonable? Is the counterfactual that's being constructed believable? Are enough states getting this law so that you can start generalizing that maybe it's the law as opposed to something else that happened in the state? There's a lot of synthetic control studies that have just a single state being treated. And, that's a persuasive argument that something happened that year, the year that a gun law passed. But it's not a very persuasive argument that that's a generalizable effect of that gun law. It could have been something else that happened in that year. Some papers have classified policies wrong. Some have unreasonable approaches to missing this. Some violate model assumptions. And then a lot of papers have a real problem with potential model overfit, like where they are where they're estimating so many parameters that they've got almost as many parameters they're estimating as observations. And we critique projects that have that kind of overfit threat. Okay, so now we score all of the papers that we've identified as potentially estimated causal effect. Now we have to aggregate the papers within these policy outcome pairs. So if there's like 3 papers on the effects of standard ground laws on homicides, then we rank what we call the level of evidence for an effect of standard ground on homicides. Then we got this ranking from no evidence to inconclusive, limited, moderate, and supportive evidence. Supportive is the highest. There has to be multiple studies showing the same effect, significant effect, and they have to be on more than one data set, independent data set. So it could be on, this time period versus this time period, or this population versus that population, but it has to be independent estimates from different data sets to get the supportive rating. And I think you yesterday may have seen what our latest rankings are. So I'll go through these sort of quickly. But right now, there's only 3 of the 18 policies that have any supportive evidence. And that's minimum age requirements for purchasing firearms seem to reduce firearm suicides among young people. Child access prevention laws appear to reduce firearm suicides, accidental firearm injuries and deaths, firearm homicides, and assaults among children and adolescents. And they may actually have some effect on older people as well. Standard ground laws increase homicides and firearm homicides. And this is actually kind of a problem because a lot of states have these laws. And of course, they're passed because the expectation is that if people can defend themselves more effectively and without risk of being prosecuted, as much risk of being prosecuted, that everyone will be safer. And that it appears that homicides are increasing as a result of these laws. But what we don't know is whether, how many of these extra homicides are defensive gun use. We have some back of the envelope calculations that suggest that can't explain the increase in homicides. But there's real data problems with demonstrating that convincingly. And then I think I said 3, but there's 4. There's supportive evidence that permissive concealed carry laws increase homicides and firearm homicides and overall violent crime. This is also a problem because in 2022, the Supreme Court made this the law of the land. That in the Bruin decision, it said every state has to have these this form of permissive concealed carry law. And so, by our judgment, we are suffering increased firearm violence as a result of having to make changes like that, unless we've been successful in countering with new innovations. There's a few laws, 3 I think, that we find moderate evidence for. This is our second highest rating. Prohibitions associated with domestic violence seem to reduce total and firearm intimate partner homicides. Specific ones like firearm divestment laws and laws that about violent misdemeanors that prevent people with violent misdemeanors from having a firearm. Background checks seem to reduce total and firearm homicides. Waiting period requirements reduce firearm suicides and total homicides. I'm not going to keep going through it all. You can look on our website, and we've got a grid like this. You can click on any cell in the grid and go to an essay that says everything we've found and how we rated things. I know you can't read this. The left down this side is the policies. The columns are the different outcomes. And the point I want to make is just visual here, which is that there's a lot of white spaces. There's a lot that hasn't even been studied yet about the effects of gun laws. There's a whole lot of gray spaces. And these are all spaces where we only have inconclusive evidence. And we need better research or better data. And then there's just those few darker blue ones that I just went through. So bottom line, there's good evidence, but for relatively few firearm laws at this point. There's a lot we don't know about the effects of gun laws because, number one, we haven't studied them. There hasn't been very much funding for this kind of work. Another big problem is often the data that you would want to understand the effects of these gun laws is not available. And lastly, it's possible that the effects of individual gun laws are small and that it's just going to be very hard to tease out those law effects because of the low statistical power. Another thing we've considered, though, is that maybe we're looking for law effects in the wrong way. Maybe we're cutting the system of laws too narrowly into too fine a chunk, and limiting what we can find about gun laws. Maybe these gun laws work more as a system, in combination with each other. And so we have looked at that. We've tried jointly estimating gun laws so that we can estimate combined effects of multiple laws. We did it with 10 state firearm level laws in data from 1981 to 2019. We used a model that we had shown had the highest power of statistical power of all the of hundreds of models that we tested in the report I mentioned earlier. And to give you a sense of what the results were, in this chart, IRR is the incident rate ratio, and the way you read it is you say dealer background checks have an IRR of 0.99. That means that we estimate that turning on dealer background checks reduces firearm mortality by 1%. And the 80% credible interval there says that that's a pretty bad estimate. It could be low, it could be lower than 1, it could be higher than 1. And that there's about a 66% chance that it lowers firearm mortality, which means it's about 50-50. We don't know. There are one or two laws that have larger effects. For instance, child access prevention laws is the one that has the strongest evidence here. It looks like 98% chance it reduces firearm mortality at the population level. And the effect size is about a 6% reduction. There's also some laws that we estimate as having a pretty good chance of harming firearm mortality rates. This 10% chance of reducing deaths can be translated as 90% chance of increasing deaths. But again, it's a very small effect. In general, all these effects are quite small when you look at these laws individually. And what we wanted to know was, is it possible that by combining laws together, these multiple small effects would add up to a more powerful large effect, or a more detectable large effect? And the answer to that is yes. When we set the model so that we are turning off all the permissive laws and turning on all the restrictive laws, we see an effect, 99%, it's higher than that, probability of reduced firearm mortality, and an effect size of 18%, which is starting to be real numbers. 18% shift in firearm mortality is equivalent to about 63,000 deaths over a decade. So I wouldn't say 18% is a big change, but it's a moderately good sized change. So the point being that I think there's pretty strong evidence that restrictive firearm policies working in concert have a detectable, moderately large effect. And this reveals a kind of trade-off between, do you carve it up into narrow bins of individual laws, which are then much harder to detect an effect in, but on the other hand, are much better for policy guidance. I mean, if you could tell a state that stand your ground laws are probably increasing their firearm homicide rates, that's something pretty actionable. But if you tell them that this whole collection of laws has a big effect, it's harder to act on that, especially when some of these laws probably don't have any effect. You know, we don't know, we can't say exactly which is contributing. And I think that there's more to be done here. I suspect that the real way that these laws work together is with some interaction effects. There's some things like maybe universal background checks work best when a state has a firearm registration system that would allow you to enforce those universal background checks. That's an interaction. You have to have the one in order to get the effect from the other. And I just suspect that this is probably where some of the action is in the way these laws work together. But it's very, very hard to study. We haven't tried. We don't think that we know how to do it in a way that would be likely to have enough statistical power to detect those effects. So I want to return to this question and suggest that I don't think these pretty small effects that we're looking at explain this kind of variation. I think there's got to be other things that are driving these differences. And we certainly hear this from the public and policymakers. Curious if anyone has any research that they know of that might explain some of this other than laws, or any hunches about what the factors are that drive these differences. Any ideas? Yeah.
Well, you don't want to hear them all now, but yes, laws are weak and crude and reflect the culture. That is more than reason. And there's a ton of other interventions that are plausible besides law.
Yeah.
Besides just live in a culture that's real safe and happy. Montana and Massachusetts are real different.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways besides law. So
what are some of those differences I'm asking? What are the differences that drive these rate differences?
Education, training, perception of risk and harm and danger, a culture of safety orientation, paranoia, and discomfort with one's competence to address risk.
Okay. Yeah. Maria?
Enforcement of the laws. In some places, the law enforcement, I live in New Mexico, do not enforce some of the laws that are on the book for keeping firearms safe and secured and out of the hands of certain folks.
Yeah. Other thoughts?
I'm from Montana. We have isolated communities, same as what my colleagues said. Those laws are enforced differently. We also have high veteran population, isolated within small community, sustenance hunting community. So I think the interpretation desensitization is a high concern.
Yeah, Allison? Firearm ownership rates. That certainly is likely with the suicide. Others? I mean, and there's good evidence for that. I think all of these ideas are very plausible. I have seen evidence for this one. Other thoughts? Okay. Yeah, these are representative of the kinds of things we hear from policymakers and the public. When gun laws are talked about, very often people poo-poo them and dismiss them and say, well, you know, if our economy was as good as California's, we'd probably have a lower homicide rate than California. Or actually, a state legislator from Elizabeth's home state told me, well, the only reason we have a high suicide rate is because of the Native American reservations. Is that plausible? Is it possible? What do we know about this? Why don't we know about this? Why don't we know very much about this? Well, part of the reason is it's really hard to establish associations between these kind of state characteristics and firearm mortality in a credible way. And there's a few specific reasons that we've tried to overcome recently. One is, again, only 50 states, but there's dozens of possible measures state characteristics, let's say domains like economic conditions, educational conditions. And then within each domain, there's thousands of possible measures you could use to evaluate those. And so there's a super high risk of cherry picking or overfitting your model. And secondly, the associations between state characteristics and outcomes for a given state might significantly influence the model estimates. If you only have 50 states, and like one of them is extreme on some characteristic and has some outcome, it's really going to influence that model. And now you've got the model overfit because you've only got 50 states, and you've got a biased representation of the association between those that characteristic and states. And lastly, there's like an unlimited number of possible functional forms. Is it curvilinear? Are there interactions? You know, all these different ways you could look at this to try to understand the association. And who chooses the right form? You know, it's very difficult to do this kind of work persuasively. And I haven't seen a whole lot of persuasive work. We had some ideas about how we might do this. And so we've done a kind of proof of concept study where we took 5 mortality outcomes. You could see them on the left there. And 5 broad state characteristic domains, demographics, economic conditions, geography, firearm prevalence, and political climate. For each of these domains, we picked a handful of candidate measures of those domains. So for instance, population demographics, we've got gender ratio, which is very surprisingly strongly associated, share of residents born outside the US, racial and ethnic composition. This is actually 10 variables, it's 10 different types. Age distribution, that's 14 different levels. We've got economic conditions, including poverty rate, income inequality, unemployment, distribution of educational attainment, geography features like percent of households in urban areas, population density, latitude, census geographic division. Firearm prevalence, we didn't have that many measures. We had our own estimates of household firearm ownership, and then we used these 2, fraction of suicides as a proportion of all suicides, and fraction of homicides as a fraction of all homicides, and then some political climate kinds of measures. And so now our goal is to overcome all of those obstacles that I just went through on the last slide. And so our approach to doing this was we estimated models on just 49 states and then used the 50th state as an out-of-sample prediction. We used the model from the 49 states to predict the 50th state. So that 50th state can't be contributing to the model. It's an out-of-sample prediction. We repeat that process once for every state characteristic, and every mortality outcome. And so that's like 50 states times 5 characteristics times 5 outcomes, 1,250 models. It's actually a lot more. And then we use this flexible machine learning algorithm to learn the associations between the state characteristics and the outcome. And because it's this flexible machine learning algorithm, it decides which variables enter the model, and it decides what the functional forms are. It can detect interactions if they are there in the data, and it can detect nonlinearities if they're there in the data. So we don't have to pre-specify any of that stuff. And what that does is it allows us then to get an out-of-sample estimate of what we would expect each state to have as a firearm rate, or as a mortality rate, what we would expect them to have based on other states with similar characteristics. So here, what I've plotted here are the states where we have the true homicide rate in dark blue, and we're comparing that to the model-based estimates from states with similar demographic characteristics. All right, so what this suggests is that there are states like Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, New Mexico, Tennessee that have much, much higher uh, uh, homicide rates than would be expected just based on their demographics. So to the people who wanted to say, well, it's because there's a very large Black population in this state, we say, I don't think so. I mean, that may contribute partly to it if there's that association, but there's something else going on in these states that is not explained by demographics. There are other states like Delaware, Minnesota, my home state, New York, where this out of sample estimate of what you would expect the mortality rate to be based on other states that have similar demographics suggests that these states are doing much better than you'd expect based on their demographics. Now what we can do is we've got these model-based estimates of how much state characteristics predict for each state their rate would be, and we have true rates. Now we can get a correlation between those two and look at what the correlation between this domain, in this case, demographic characteristics, and mortality is. And when we do that, what I've got plotted here are the 5 outcomes against the 5 domains. And these values in the grid are R-squared values. They're not correlations, they're R-squared values. And the first thing to note is just how large these numbers are. You know, R-squareds of 0.70. So the way you could read, let me tell you how to read this. Like demographic characteristics by firearm homicide, 0.70. That means 70% of state variation in firearm homicide rates can be explained by demographic characteristics. That's a really, really large correlation, explained variance. And what you see here is that demographic characteristics and economic conditions are the top factors explaining firearm homicide and total firearm deaths, whereas geographic factors and firearm prevalence are the strongest correlates of of firearm suicide and total suicide. And I can't emphasize enough how large I think these numbers are, how strong these associations are, and how threatening that is to modeling gun policy effects if you aren't controlling for factors like this correctly, because these are powerful confounds. I want to be really, really clear about one thing. I'm not suggesting in any way, and the model doesn't suggest, that demographic characteristics cause firearm homicide rates, or that any of these things cause each other. They're part of an, this is purely associational, and there's probably all kinds of things that go along with demographic characteristics, like economic conditions and geographic factors, and we haven't done them all together. We're sort of separating them out by domain. So what we've just done, last month, we put up online the results of these analyses in an interactive tool. We've got lots of interactive tools on our website. And this one allows you to look at all the different domains and all the different state mortality outcomes, and look at how much states' mortality rates are explained by, how much is not explained by those characteristics. And this is interactive, you can go through it. So right here, I've got, what I'm showing here is the map version. There's also different ways you can look at it, of the expected rate of firearm suicides compared to the actual rate. And so states that are more orange are states that have an actual rate substantially higher than the expected rate based on other states with similar firearm ownership rates. And yeah, you can. I mean, I think it's fascinating to go through and think about what is happening in these states and how we can explain why they differ so much from what would be expected based on these characteristics. All right, so what does this tell us? well, first of all, of course, that the association of a lot of these state characteristics is very strong with these mortality outcomes. Again, not a causal relationship. They pose a challenge for policy analysis, as I just mentioned. Another big challenge is that some of these are not just confounds; they're probably colliders, meaning that like if firearm ownership might in a state might drive the decision to pass certain laws. Places that have high firearm ownership might tend to pass certain kinds of laws, and those certain kinds of laws might have an effect on firearm ownership as well as other outcomes. And in that situation, you've got a collider, and you can't control for it in the same way that you would other kinds of confounds in a model, presenting big challenges for modeling causal effects. Some states look like they have much higher or lower mortality rates than expected based on state characteristics alone. And I think that that's very interesting to think about what is going on in that state. What if it's not the gun laws, and it's not, and you can't explain it by like that map we just had up there a minute ago. Wyoming has a higher suicide rate than can be explained by firearm ownership rates. There's something else going on. I mean, we knew that firearm ownership rates was a factor, but there's something else going on there. And I think that this is an interesting way of starting to focus in on what those other factors are that may be driving some of these rates. All right, final thoughts, and then I'm going to open it up for questions and discussion. Is that estimating law effects is difficult, and there is evidence of specific effects that is accumulating and maybe increasingly strong. But it's important to keep in mind that lack of evidence for effects of gun laws is not the same as evidence that the laws lack effects. We are always being misrepresented in the media, particularly by certain groups, as suggesting that, Rand has shown that assault weapons bans don't work. Whereas in fact, what we've shown is that there's no evidence that there's no strong evidence that assault weapons bans have any of these effects. That's not to say that they don't work. I mean, some of these things just haven't been studied or are very difficult to study. I think there's some suggestion in what I've presented that law effects may be easier to detect if we think about combinations of laws and how they work together. I think there's a lot more that could be done on that. There's super strong associations between state characteristics and mortality rates, and I don't think we've thought hard enough about what that means for understanding gun policy, understanding what the levers are that affect those state characteristics, and that may also be affecting mortality rates. And I think there's a lot more that could be done on that. Let's see, what else do I want to say? Well, I think I'll stop there. Thank you, and appreciate your attention, and I'd be very happy to take questions or challenges or thoughts.
You guys have done such a fabulous and smart job of looking at policy. Is there any appetite over at RAND for looking at other kinds of influences, mitigating strategies besides law? I personally am a little bit tired of law, and I have an antipathy, but I'm real interested in education, training, culture, other sorts of interventions. You guys could apply this same science to that. Are you interested, or is someone doing work in that?
It's something that I'm interested in doing. We have 3 times now submitted proposals to look at what's the word? Government funding programs like Medicaid and food. What's it called? The SNAP. Thank you. SNAP and housing assistance and other kinds of assistance programs, and how those may be affecting firearm violence. We haven't gotten that funded yet. Short answer, yeah, we're really interested in those things. And I agree with you. I tend to think that the kinds of laws we pass in this country around guns have to pass the Second Amendment hurdle. And there's a limit to how powerful these laws can be. I think you're right that there's likely to be other kinds of interventions that may be more promising that the states and federal government could be levering.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I'm wondering if you can get into the weeds a little bit about the algorithm that was used, specifically like the type technique, or if there's somewhere online where I can look up more about that.
Yeah, well, yeah, we have a public report I can direct you to, but you're talking about the machine learning algorithm. Yeah, it was XGBoost. We used it with, I think, 5-fold cross validation, and then this second layer of out of sample modeling.
And one more question I have was, for some states, it seems like it would be harder to create like a comparative state for it. For instance, like Hawaii. How did you navigate that?
Really good point. It is possible that some of the states that are most extreme on certain of these characteristics don't have a really good set of comparison states, and so we may not have excellent resolution on what the expected value would be for at the extremes of the scale. But otherwise, there's a fair amount of overlap between things like economic conditions between states, that can be used to leverage this. But I mean, your point is very good. This has been a problem with synthetic control models for a long time, that states like Hawaii come into or the synthetic controls for a given state end up being just two other states, and one of them's Hawaii, and you're like, this is not possible. Yeah, so establishing a counterfactual really hard.
I'm going to take microphone privileges and ask one of our online questions for the room. Is there a possibility of contagion or diffusion of some of these policies that contribute to smaller magnitude in effects, i.e. a very permissive state being close to a restrictive state as a possible source of diluting the effects? And if so, how do you go about addressing that challenge?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. And it's obviously true. People cross state lines to get guns that they can't get in their own state. And so that is definitely happening. I'm aware of 2 studies that have tried to estimate these sort of cross-contamination effects. And they're really hard to get your head around because because there's so many different ways that there ends up being potential feedback loops in this sort of thing. It's something we've thought a lot about and have not come up with a good solution for, but it's obviously an important question.
Thank you for your talk. In thinking about the kind of the topic of the latter half and these characteristics, clearly we're limited by the states, which makes sense for the policy, which, those policies tend to maybe only be by state, but it seems there's an opportunity with looking at characteristics to leverage some lower unit of analysis and to overcome some of those challenges. Or do you have any thoughts on what we could do about heterogeneity within a state and sort of, I know we have limitations with the outcome, but our characteristics maybe are more available at some lower level.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And this was more like a kind of proof of concept for how we might get over some of these problems. But I agree with you. If you have characteristics at the county level or lower, and there are some studies that have done this sort of thing, obviously, that may give finer resolution on what these associations are or what's driving them, maybe. I agree.
That's how you walk across the room. This was really wonderful, Andrew. I really appreciate the proof of concept analysis. I don't think I've ever heard analysis described in that way. When you talked about the social demographic variables, I thought it was interesting that people born outside the US was one of the metrics that was captured. Could you speak to the rationale for including that? And a follow-up to that is, was that the entire list of demographic factors that were considered?
Yeah, it's definitely I think it's the entire list. Why did we pick that one? I think it's one of the variables that we have regularly found enter our models of gun policy. We often go through a process of trying to decide which covariates to include in our models of gun policy. And I think we picked it because it's one of those variables that does enter. And actually, I won't try to pull it up. I had a slide that showed what the top predicting variable was in each of these domains in this analysis, and percent foreign born was frequently one of them.
Thank you, Andrew. I was interested in, so first I appreciated RAND's efforts to be clear in what they're doing and also produce data sets and tools that others can use. I mean, I remember 10 to 15 years ago, if you wanted to do research, it's like, well, you've got this really old Burfus data, or you could get the HCUP data, which was still on disk at the time, and you had to work with the disks. And so what has changed in the past 10 years, in large part from your contribution, has been really fantastic. But you also alluded to very early on, there's still a real shortage of data that's needed to answer some of these analyses. To your mind, if we were to contribute thinking to the development of new data collection or new data collection resources, what would that be that you think would most accelerate some of this work?
I think it's very topic specific, what you're focused on. The NORC, which is a research organization sort of like RAND, they had an Arnold Ventures funded project to look at the firearms research data infrastructure and what's needed. And they have a sort of blue panel report on it. They had a lot of different ideas about ways that UCR data could be made, uniform crime reporting data could be made more useful. I think an obvious big gap is firearm injury rates in the country, or non-fatal firearm hospitalizations or emergency department visits. One of the big challenges for understanding in policy analysis, you really would like to start getting at what the trade-offs are between choices. And we've only done that, a very little bit of that, because some of the things that we're trading off are very poorly measured. And one of them is defensive gun use. There's a whole history of people trying to measure defensive gun use, which is obviously extremely important. Most people who are buying firearms these days buy it for defensive purposes. And so if we could get a better handle on that, I think we'd be in a much better position to start understanding what some of those trade-offs. I'll keep thinking about it, but there's, I'll just make one more comment about that, which is that we kind of are shooting ourselves in the foot in some of these ways. Burfus, which you mentioned, collected household firearm ownership rates until 2004 and hasn't since then. Why aren't we collecting that data in every state? I know the answer is it's very political and states threaten to pull out if it's in there, and but I don't think that I think that there's a strong argument for including it and overcoming those barriers.
Thank you, Andrew, for a really wonderful talk. It's so great to have you here. So as you know, we're doing this training course this week for a bunch of phenomenal earlier than me career scientists. So with your mentor hat on, what advice would you give around being in this space of doing science related to policy, but remaining apolitical?
Yeah.
Especially when we think about federal funding and the importance of being nonpartisan, what advice would you give people about that space?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I was talking about this earlier today with people. What I observe, and maybe you agree, is that in the area among the big gun violence prevention research groups, there's kind of a split between the groups that tend to be public health oriented and feel very strongly about advocating for what they believe is going to protect the public. And I think that's a real tradition in public health, and I understand it. But it puts them in a position of advocating for policies that are going to turn off a big part of the audience that they're trying to reach. I think, they disagree, I'm sure. What we've done at RAND and what we typically do is try to be nonpartisan, and try not to. RAND often makes policy recommendations. We don't in this project. We try to be more like an umpire. It's showing what we believe to be true from the evidence that we have, out of fear that if we came out and said states should stop, should repeal stand your ground laws, that a big part of America would say, oh, they're biased, and fair enough. We can't say yet what the trade-offs on that would be. What we can say is it looks like it increases homicides, but we can't say, how it affects the gun industry or defensive gun use or home invasions and robberies or whatever else it might be. And so we have taken the stance of not advocating in this space for policy recommendations, instead just trying to articulate what we believe we know.
Hi, thank you. I had a question about just asked you about and what you were just talking about, but in the spirit of trying to remain nonpartisan, I was wondering, if there are better language choices we can make around the defensive gun use, realm, because when you were giving your 4 main points of this is what we found, people who have suicidal intent are easily evoke a vulnerability, much like children. And then when you switch into talking about defensive gun use, I think it evokes people's sense of self-protection. And so even if it's not political, it's psychological switch of how you consider why you would want to have access to a firearm. And so is there a better way, a more neutral way to enter into conversations with people who have very different political views or different value systems to help diffuse what, at least in my world, can become a very quickly charged conversation when you're trying to talk about reducing deaths, not law or politics?
I'm sure you're right that there's better and worse ways of talking about these things, and we try to be sensitive to this. When the first time we issued this report, we sent it to the NRA and to the National Shooting Sports Foundation and to Everytown and to Brady, and asked them to comment on it, not on the science, but on whether we were using language that was going to trip us up in ways that that we didn't intend to. I mean, we weren't offering to change our findings. What we were offering was to hear from them whether the language we were using or the ways we were talking about or the ways we were thinking about things revealed biases in their eyes. And we got feedback on things like that. Like the National Shooting Sports Foundation really hated that we used the term assault weapon. And so we still used assault weapon, but we explained that these are also called, modern sport shooting rifles, but that in the laws that we're talking about, they're referred to as assault weapons. So we've done that sort of thing. I'm curious about your thought about defensive gun use. What does that trigger, do you think, and what might a better term be? What was your thought about that?
My thought was, well, I live in Baltimore, and I study urban gun violence, which is a very different type of firearm injury than like some of the more rural parts of my state where people use guns for hunting and sport and for self-protection. And to level the playing field of engaging people all over the state in an issue that's very polarizing and where the people making decisions don't live in the places where people are most affected by gun violence. I am always listening to the way that other people talk about firearms to try to become a more responsible steward of information. And at an earlier point in my career, I was much more willing to go down to Annapolis and scream at legislators. Now I'm finding that that's not really changing things. And also like these laws are changing, but not necessarily changing who is affected by gun violence in the work that I do. So just thinking about different ways to engage different partners,
Okay,
leverage resources.
I
And
agree.
your information that you shared today is like a really great tool. But even just saying stand your ground is like drawing a line in the sand between people who believe one thing about guns and other people.
Right. Yeah. Some call it a right to shoot, and we acknowledge that in our report, but we go with stand your ground because that's what these laws are often called.